Success to everyone. Thank you, Cameron.
Excited to hear you, Cameron.
Good luck.
Hola a todas y todos, buenas tardes, buenas noches, buenos días en Australia, donde está Cameron. Bueno, mi nombre es Nicolás Rebolledo, yo soy director de estrategia de UNIT y en esta ocasión, por segundo año consecutivo, estamos colaborando con el área de diseño del Ministerio de las Culturas, Artes y el Patrimonio del Gobierno de Chile para diseñar este festival de ideas y conversaciones en el contexto del Mes del Diseño. Es importante decir que este Mes del Diseño, o el área de diseño, cumple ya 10 años, y este Mes del Diseño cumple 10 años. Y qué mejor para, por decirlo así, conmemorarlo, que preguntarnos qué significa la transición del diseño, o hacia dónde va el diseño. Y ese es el nombre que le hemos puesto a este ciclo, Diseño en Tránsito. Es importante decir que cuando nos tocó diseñar este festival el año pasado, el 2020, fue un momento, digamos, en el cual estábamos, por decirlo así, en un momento de perplejidad, o de total perplejidad. Veníamos del estallido del 2019, estábamos, ya no sé, llevábamos un par de meses, o sea, perdón, unos 6 meses en la pandemia, y nos pareció pertinente preguntarnos en ese minuto, cuando fuimos invitados a reflexionar acerca del diseño, fue interesante para nosotros preguntarnos qué significaba diseñar hoy, pensando en esta idea o en este momento de detención o de perplejidad. Y a partir de preguntarnos qué significa diseñar hoy, tratar de abrir, por decirlo así, los distintos actores y relaciones que el área de diseño tiene y tenía con las distintas dimensiones del diseño, y inaugurar este festival de ideas y conversaciones a propósito de eso. El año pasado tuvimos bastante masivo, tuvimos más de 84 speakers, fueron alrededor de 17 sesiones, etc. Dicho eso, este año yo creo que es importante decir que el 2020 estábamos en la mitad, digamos, en este minuto de incertidumbre y tensión, pero yo creo, perdón, el 2021, y este 2021 yo creo que es un minuto donde las cosas han empezado a tomar su curso, ¿no? El estallido tomó el curso del proceso constituyente, digamos, la pandemia se supone, o al parecer estamos empezando a terminarla, y yo creo que ya los lugares se están empezando a abrir, y yo creo que aparece como algo interesante preguntarnos hacia dónde vamos, cuáles son esos tránsitos o cuáles son esas rutas en las que estamos transitando, y en el caso del diseño, digamos, cuáles son las rutas que transita el diseño y cuáles son los destinos, digamos, que empiezan a aparecer para esta disciplina que cada vez más está teniendo impacto en diferentes sectores de la economía y de la sociedad. Y esa es la razón por la cual, en el fondo, le pusimos este nombre del diseño en tránsito a este ciclo. Este ciclo es un poco más corto que el año pasado, consiste más o menos en 10 sesiones, sumado a un montón de otros eventos que están y que pueden ver en la página web, pero la estructura que le quisimos dar fue de básicamente 5 temas, ¿no? Partir hoy con el tema del diseño en transición, y voy a hablar un poquito acerca de eso, y para eso tenemos a nuestro invitado Cameron Tonkinwise, que en un minuto va a estar acá con nosotros, y el panel que tuvimos en la mañana de experiencia sostenible. Pero la idea es abrir hoy día preguntándonos, digamos, cuáles son como los pilares, diría yo, reflexivos más fundamentales que debiésemos usar, digamos, desde dónde mirar este problema del diseño de transición y hacia dónde vamos, principalmente impactado por los cambios sociales y la emergencia climática. Luego vamos a tener mañana, vamos a tener a Say Junginger, que nos va a abrir con una clase magistral también sobre nuevas perspectivas en diseño social. El miércoles va a ser el tema de diálogo intercultural, con una masterclass y también un panel. Y la próxima semana ya nos vamos a aproximar a mirar diseño en la era digital, diseño y antropología, y por último, diseño y futuro. Entonces son 5 o 6 temas en los cuales estamos mirando para poder abrir esta discusión respecto de hacia dónde va el diseño y cuáles son esos tránsitos. Cameron, si puedes prender tu cámara para poder presentarte. There you are. Thank you, Cameron. Bueno, tenemos en esta ocasión, como dije, tenemos para mí, digamos, un privilegio, una suerte, digamos, de contar con el profesor Cameron Tonkinwise, que tuve la oportunidad de conocer cuando estaba estudiando en RCA, y desde ahí sigo su trabajo. El profesor Tonkinwise, que nos está visitando desde Australia, o sea, ya son las 8 de la mañana, es muy temprano. El profesor Cameron es un experto internacional en estudios de diseño, y en este concepto de diseño transición, y él se va a dedicar un poco de su charla a abrir de qué se trata de eso, y es director de investigación del Centro de Investigación e Innovación en Diseño de la Universidad Tecnológica de Sydney. Cameron escribe y habla extensamente sobre el poder del diseño para impulsar cambios a nivel de sistemas, para lograr futuros más sostenibles y equitativos. Es interesante decir que el background de Cameron también tiene que ver con filosofía, digamos, y con teoría. Y eso yo creo que es un aporte a la disciplina cuando se empieza a enfrentar con la pregunta disciplinar y práctica de hacia dónde va el diseño. Cameron también creo que es importante decir que ha abogado durante mucho tiempo por la importancia de ponerle rigor a los estudios del diseño. Yo creo que ahí hay algo que para nosotros los diseñadores es importante poder sobreponernos a digamos, el imperio comodificado del design thinking o del pensamiento de diseño con una perspectiva más rigurosa, tratando de identificar cuáles son los espacios donde el diseño puede hacer un verdadero cambio. Muchas gracias, Cameron. Thank you very much, Cameron, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you for the privilege of being able to speak to you today. It's a real honor. And as you've indicated, I would really like to speak philosophically, but particularly also towards this political moment in your context. And as you've indicated, to really try to identify new ways of thinking about design that I think can make contributions to how our societies transition out of the pandemic and transition to new forms of governance. So it's that I will speak to. So I should commence, Nicholas?
Yeah, please do. Just a quick one. Para los que están viéndonos acá en Zoom, esta charla tiene traducción simultánea. Pueden apretar abajo, hay un signo del mundo que dice interpretación, y ahí tienen que cliquear el idioma en el cual quieren escucharnos, que en este caso, si están en español es español, y si están en inglés es inglés.
Okay, thank you, Nicholas, and thank you everyone who has organised and made it possible for me to speak to you. As Nicholas indicated, I am speaking from Sydney, Australia. That's the settler colonial term for where I am situated. I am situated within Sydney on what is known as the land of the Gadigal language group, part of the Eora Nation. These are the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who never ceded this country to settler colonials like me. So I am speaking to you with the privilege of being on stolen land, land that always was, always will be Aboriginal land. As Australia tries to continue to reconcile with its Indigenous population, this has not been an act that we have accomplished. There is still much to do, much suffering and much historical suffering that needs reparations and return of land. So it's important to indicate to you that I speak to you from a country that is still in transition, in a funny way, dealing with its own past, which it has not yet done. So I speak to you from that context. As Nicholas indicated, I had the great privilege of teaching at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, United States. I was in the US for 10 years, teaching at Parsons and then at Carnegie Mellon. And while at Carnegie Mellon, working with Terry Irwin, the head of school, and her partner, Gideon Kossoff, the three of us began thinking about how can design, which tends to operate at the human scale product level, whether those products are communications, actual artifacts, devices, interiors, design works at the human scale. How can design at that scale nevertheless help large societal transitions? How can designers enable societies to transition to more equitable and sustainable futures? And so we began a research project assembling new types of knowledge, new ways of designing, new ways of being designers that could help contribute to this transition. And this is ongoing work. Terry Irwin is very diligent about sharing all publications in this area that any of us produce. So just look for Terry Irwin at CMU. The whole of the Transition Design Seminar, for example, that Terry and Gideon teach at CMU is online, so you can teach yourself a lot of what we are learning. It's not fixed, it's not a method, it's just an approach by which designers can take responsibility for the scale at which they operate. It tends to use a European theory called transition management, which I won't talk about so much today. It's just that large landscapes are changing, not just in Chile, but around the world. We are seeing the setup of the 20th century fracturing, sometimes not well, and we are now in a moment in which we can reassemble our society. So what is design's role in that restructure? And much of transition design is what we call vision-led. Much of design, much of European design in the 20th century had strong, bold, modernist visions, utopias. They were designed by very few people, and they tended to be Procrustean. Procrustes is the Greek myth of somebody who makes a box. And if you don't fit in the box, you just chop off everybody's limbs until they do fit in the box. So a lot of modernism had a vision, but the vision was very fixed and small, and people were made to fit in the box. Transition design, by contrast, is about enabling people to participate in imagining another way of living, to imagine other types of societies, and then to backcast how to make design decisions that will orient us in those directions. So this is transition design. What I'm going to speak to you about today is particularly on the left-hand side, the new ways of designing. I want to talk to you about co-design as a bit of a revolution occurring in design at the moment at many levels. And I want to talk about the way in which co-design enables transitions. And I understand that you'll hear more of this, particularly from Sabine's talk, which is coming, which is also about social design, and obviously also Evgeny Morozov when he talks around kind of what is enabled by digital connectivity. So there might be some interesting connections there. So as I said, I will begin quite philosophically, particularly to engage at this moment at which Chile is doing constitutional design. When we do politics, we are making regulations, we legislate, we make a constitution. But in a lot of ways, what laws specify is what is irregular. They define what is illegal. So they create a boundary and they create everything that is outside the boundary as illegal in order to clear space for the middle. Design is what takes responsibility for regulating the everyday. Laws regulate the irregular, design regulates the regular. Designers do this by animating products, built environments, by putting human sensibility into things. Bruno Latour, the French philosopher, calls this delegating morality. And he's written a whole essay on this door closer here, compressed air door closer. And he basically says what it's doing is making a certain ethic of society durable. It's saying doors should be closed. Don't leave doors open. That's the morality of a door. And normally we ask humans to do that. But sometimes humans are fallible. They don't always do it. So instead we design a door closer to close the door automatically for us. We make society durable through design. Designers animate products that then help us be the society we want to be. And obviously this is the kind of tactical urbanism, which happened, for example, in Santiago, where particular interventions into a space will delegate that the space changes behavior. People have to slow down because they can't see the markings in the road. And that enables another way of living. This is a very small example of a transition design. Design regulating the regular aspects of society. So design is very powerful at this small political level. And much of what I want to say to you this morning is when thinking about the politics of a nation, I think it is important to also take this opportunity to think about the politics of artifacts, the politics that regulate the regular, and what it is that those designers are doing when they animate objects, environments, to structure how we live. What are they making these decisions based on? Because when a designer makes something, that thing services us, it helps us, but it can only do that by constraining us, by telling us to interact with it in a particular way. A door handle, in this very literal example, is telling you how to interact with it so that the door can be opened. A seat instructs you in how to sit so that it can take your weight. So things service us, but only when we comply with how they have been designed to interact with us. So there is a compliance involved in letting design structure our everyday lives. This is what colleagues I work with, Tony Fry, Anne-Marie Willis, myself, and now Arturo Escobar, have begun to describe as ontological design, which is that design designs products that design people who do the designing, as Tara Campbell and her colleague Ariana have illustrated here as a way to show. So we are liberated by design. We delegate to things, things do things for us, but only by designing us in the way in which we then interact with them. It is a circle which is liberating and constraining at the same time. It's a very particular politics. Designers don't talk about design in this way. A lot of designers are allergic to thinking that their designs of communications, products, and environments are political, but they are always political. They are always making particular ways of being a human durable. They are locking it into the material environment. And in this way, designers can begin to help steer, not direct, but help navigate transitions in society. So then there's this question. So who are these people who are making the things that do things for us, but only by constraining us? In the history of humanity, presumably at some point, everybody made everything they needed. At some point, there is a division of labor. And we say some people are better at making and other people are better at cooking or teaching or childcare. And so we have this division and the makers make. In this case, we have a Sheffield steel maker, still hand making scissors, sharpening, polishing, very beautiful work. So we have an artisan who makes. So in this case, I need scissors, the maker makes the scissors, and I let myself be designed by the maker through what they make. So I have this trade-off. You make it, I comply, but I don't have to focus on the making. So we have this division of labor. And this is the political question: who gets to make these things? If the maker is local, if I know the maker, if it is actually an artisan, then I can interact with the maker. I can suggest other ways of designing it. I can have the product repaired. But if it is a global supply chain and the product is coming from I don't know where and is made by I don't know who, then I have less power to influence the way in which the things are structuring me. Design arose according to a particular history of European design, in this case, the short introduction to John Chris Jones's 1970s book, Design Methods. He argues design arose because people started crafting larger things like warships to be imperial and colonial around the world. And to make a large thing, you needed to coordinate lots of artisans, lots of craft makers. And to coordinate, you had to make sure they made the right thing in the right way. So somebody drew plans of what to make, and they specified what that artisan makes in terms of this particular hole in the ship and this particular winch in the ship and this particular back and front on the ship. They specify. So design, literally kind of drawing, in both the Romance languages, Spanish, French, design as drawing, draws to specify what is to be made. In this way, design enters and shifts in a very beautiful characterization by David Pye. We shift from craft, the workmanship of risk, how David Pye characterizes it, because it's handmade, no matter how skilled, the wood and the hand always risks a fault. Whereas in design, it's the workmanship of certainty. We shift from craft workmanship of risk to design workmanship of certainty, because we have designs that specify what is to be made. This then allows the reproduction of the identical for the first time in humanity. For the first time in humanity, design allows us to make millions of the one thing exactly the same. Now, this is, I think, important to register when talking about design and what design's power is. Design works at scale. Immediately, this was an issue. Immediately, European designers, the arts and crafts movement in Britain, the Werkbund in Germany, all became concerned that work was no longer satisfying, that all these products were going to be the same in everybody's house. And so design shifted. It wasn't just the planning of making, it was the applying of art to things to make sure that things were edifying, that things had a level of quality. The other thing that design does is, because it is now sketching and laying out what is to be made on paper before it is made, design now begins to make creative leaps on paper. You're looking here at apparently the placemat of Philippe Starck as he was talking to the head of a lessee about chroming products. And he is imagining while having a lunch meal, and it goes anti-clockwise from the bottom. So he eventually gets at what you would recognize as the famous Juicy Salif iconic orange juicer on the bottom left there. This is a creative leap possible because you are now deciding what to make in the virtual environment of the paper and then the computer. This allows creative leaps. So we now have the capacity to make creative leaps at scale. So design then, in summary, is the art or science, art and science, of mediating between new ideas and existing society, about taking the quality of those new ideas and trying to allow them to occur at quantity, always compromising the quality to get to the quantity, mediating between mass production and mass consumption. And the kind of enormous scale and product variety that we see in a photograph like this is the result of design and its workmanship of certainty. The result, perhaps unanticipated result, not necessarily unintended result, rather unanticipated result of scale, or the unanticipated result that happens at scale, is that our society is now stuffed with things, not equitably, different countries at different levels of stuffing themselves up. So here is an image of a North American suburban house. It's a portrait of the family done by a photographer whose name just escapes me at this point, in which he did, Menzel did this project called Material World, in which he went around the world taking portraits of families, their house and their stuff. And here, the largest household with the most stuff is the American one. And this is an unsustainable existence. There is too much stuff moving through our societies. This is what is making us unsustainable. So these things are also, as I said before, delocalized. They are not made locally. We don't have any control over what it is that they do to us. So this is the politics of globalization through design. A designer somewhere designs something. Somebody somewhere else makes it, and it gets shipped to us and then sculpts our society. So this is an interesting politics. It's not all bad. It is good to allow some aspects of our lives to be liberated by designs that might come from all over the world. But it is unsustainable to allow everything to be this kind of delocalized good. So much of transition design is inspired by the history of sustainable design and is interested in relocalizing production, relocalizing societies. Not only localizing. Localizing can be protectionist, it can be xenophobic, it can be anti-immigration. We have seen lots of neoconservative protectionist societies around the world who are causing much harm to the movement of ideas, the movement of people, and difference within our societies. So we want some combination, I would suggest, we want to transition to some combination of local yet still cosmopolitan, characterized by community economies by Catherine Gibson Graham, or by the pluriverse by Arturo Escobar, Or the slogan on the left by Ezio Manzini, slow, local, yet open and connected. This combination. And it's this idea that I want to just talk about now, to try and clarify what this weird combination looks like, a contradiction. Cosmopolitan localism, slow and local, open connected. Or, as I've titled the talk, interdependent autonomy. What does it mean to do this? I think, as I was saying, the point here is that what we are transitioning to is not only ecological sustainability, less carbon footprint because global logistics, more local, but also because local allows more control over how we design our lives at the everyday level. Localism allows us to regulate the things that regulate regular existence, everyday existence. And I'm alluding here to different concept to Michel Cayon's work on technical democracy, on how do we get a say on what technologies get made. At the moment, the only way to vote on a technology is to buy it or not buy it when it finally arrives. And that seems to be too late. So when the division of labor created design, we have lost control of how to make the things that make us. So this localism enables this. So how do we do this? How then can we transition? And to explain, I need to just set out that designing itself is changing. The way designers design is changing at many levels. And I can only talk about this in summary and very quickly. But designing is shifting from, in European history, the 20th century studio-based designing to this process of co-design. So very crudely, the history of design has been the gradual opening of design decisions up to more and more people. Design begins as an offshoot of art, with the artist making the sovereign decision about what things look like. Knowing how things are beautiful and well made, the artist makes all the decisions. When European design arrives in America, it is market research informed. You need to understand something about who you're trying to sell the product to. You can't just impose it, you need to sell it. So now doing a little bit of market research. Jump all the way to the 1980s, particularly with the influence of interaction design and digital design, people start talking about user-centered design and testing whether designs are usable. Something that was happening before then as well, but it was only codified as user-centered design, let's say in the 80s and 90s. So this is an opening up from the artist to market-informed to checking, testing the usability, to the arrival of experience design and UX, the idea that design should be structured by particular use cases, particular scenarios. The job of the designer is to imagine the actions in which the product and communication will be used. So it is opening up, but it's still mostly the designer imagining. They might do some quick ethnography, quick field research, but it's mostly imagining the use case. With the early 2000s and the arrival of human-centered design, you start to get the idea that the designer needs to go beyond quick observation, quick interviewing, actually needs to learn to empathize with other people, needs to learn to quickly immerse what often is called by companies like IDEO, big global human-centered design company, it's called a deep dive. The designer must do a quick, always quick, unfortunately, should be slow, but the designer always does a quick deep dive. They immerse themselves in the context they're designing for, and they play around in order to quickly empathize, to understand, and then go away and design. But they are still going away and design. What is happening right now is that designers are beginning to open up the process to allow users to participate in the designing process, not just to research users, but to design with users, and in some political contexts, to facilitate design by users. Now, this is very much happening now. It is not settled, it's contentious, there's lots of fights, but nevertheless, one can see that design is moving. This looks good. This looks like it's politically open. Well, unfortunately, most of it is happening because we are running out of innovations. Most of the 20th century innovations have reached households. Households in the global consumer class around the world are now stuffed with things. They don't need anything else. In fact, these days they spend most of their time, apparently, you and me, we spend most of our time consuming virtual worlds, metaverses, because our houses are static, they're stuffed, they're full, there's nothing else to put in them. So this is a worry. It's a worry for capitalism. Capitalism is very worried that it no longer has a value creation engine. And so you see lots of companies panicking, where is value? And the way they find value is, well, quick, let's participate, let's co-design, let's find people and let's design with them. Because every time we come up with something in a studio, they say, it's okay, maybe. So let's find value. So a lot of this drive to go to co-design is just capitalism looking desperately for new value propositions. However, one of the key ways of doing transition design is to recognize when a trajectory is at a bifurcation point, a turning point, a fork in the road, literally a crux, a crucifix, a moment in which you can choose one X or the other, one path or the other. And so there's capitalism co-designing, but there is increasingly a strong explicit politics of design under many guises in terms of design for disability or recognizing strengths-based work with disabled communities and people, with disadvantaged communities, with people who have been oppressed by large global capitalism. There is now a recognition that designers must take responsibility for their role in perpetuating racism, in perpetuating sexism, in perpetuating other types of class oppression. And to do that, designers need to design differently. They need community-led practices that are truly co-design. So this movement towards co-design is a turning point, it feels to me, between capitalism and just finding value. But it is also a moment in which design, almost for the first time in 100 years since its founding as part of a socialist project in Europe, for the first time, designers generally are taking seriously their role in being able to transition to more politically and ethically just communities. Part of what's happening here, and this is more design studies and theory, but there's been an argument that design has been moving to higher orders of designing. This is a diagram very famously by Richard Buchanan, who was at Carnegie Mellon University before I was. But he talks about this history of design moving from communication design, product design, interaction and service design to the design of cultures and systems and organizations. And he said this is a different type of designing. You're actually moving from material designing to design thinking. And he had different ways of characterizing those types of thinking. He always recognized that you were still doing communication and product design at the higher order. You can only design a system by designing communications and products. I think what is happening now is not just this movement in this direction, but the type of designing that happens when you do strategic service co-design is now flowing back to product and communication design. So we are now seeing this moment at which the evolution and maturing of design into being able to take responsibility for its cultural influence is now washing back and helping change the very practices of material design. Now, as I said at the outset, this is a big challenge for design, and particularly for design education. Design education will always concern learning how to make material form, learning how to notice patterns of interaction and materialize them in the form of things. And one does that in a studio, being apprenticed to other practitioners, working on complicated problems, but in the safe space of a studio. This is how design education has happened for 100 years. Literally, the Bauhaus is now 102 years old. The Europeans have announced this project, the new European Bauhaus, the equivalent of the American Green New Deal. I think it's unfortunate to take this very Eurocentric model of design and renovate it. I think it misses the point that what is new about design is co-design. And co-design means engaging with diverse people of lived experience. And it's a type of designing that is more like facilitating than form giving. And so we don't need a renovation of the Bauhaus model of education. We need to learn how to co-design co-designers. Not how do we teach co-designers, but how do we create situations in which students can have experience of diverse lived experience, communities, disadvantaged, disabled, diverse. How can people learn to enable design with and even design by? This is a big challenge. As I said, what I think is interesting about it conceptually, particularly for a country that's in the moment of doing constitutional design, is that it is a different take on localism. Often, if one says we need to relocalize our economies, you often get people like eco-modernists who will make fun of you and say, do you want everybody to go back to peasant life? Do you want everybody to go back to a third world? Do you want everybody to go back to caves? Local economies are austere, they are scarce. You don't want people to live that way. The benefits of globalization are that they allowed cheap stuff to everybody. They are equalizing. So there is this argument that you're not allowed to relocalize because it is not efficient and therefore equitable. But I think it's interesting to contrast that stupid counter to localization. I'm not a fan at all of eco-modernists. I think they back nuclear power and they are re-centralizers of large finance. I think what is the way to counter is to understand that localism is not necessarily about reducing scale of production or not having some supply chains. It's more like what is characterized as cosmo-localism, different from cosmopolitan localism. It's confusing, I'm sorry. But cosmo-localism is particularly the argument of, as you can see there, global designs that are locally manufactured. I think it should be the other way around. Design local. Take control of how we design our own societies so that they are cosmopolitanly local. And then perhaps manufacture locally, but where necessary, manufacture not globally, not global logistics, but what I'm calling more than local. So design local, and if necessary, manufacture more than local. This is about controlling the things that regulate regular life. Control is too strong. What I'm describing here has been characterized by Arturo Escobar in his work on designs for the pluriverse as designing for autonomy. And he quotes Gustavo Esteva in terms of his distinction between autonomy, where norms are established through traditional practices, they're endogenous, versus the situation of global capital, heteronomy, when people elsewhere decide how we can live, to autonomy, which is not autarky, not self-sufficiency, not a reduced scale, every nation producing for itself, still with trade, but where the local has some control over its ability to change. Autonomy is deciding on how to change, on how to design. Design for autonomy is a redundant phrase because if you are designing, you have autonomy. But at the moment, we live with goods and products that have been designed for us by others without our say. So co-design enables autonomous design for autonomy. And it's not necessarily the situation of self-sufficiency. What I'm talking about here, and it's complicated, I'm sorry, and I'm speaking quickly, but I just wanted to say, I think co-design is important new development. It's very important that transition design create visions that are co-designed, but co-design is not the answer. Design is about enabling interdependent autonomy. And I'll just finish by giving this small example, which is almost a contradiction of everything I've said, but I quite like it. What you're seeing in the pictures here are an art project in which an artist in New York City found chairs, seats that were being thrown out of houses. They were left on the sidewalk. And he picked them up and took them into the subway system where there are no seats. If you wait for a subway train, you always have to stand the whole time. Luckily, the transport system is quick and you normally don't have to stand long, but he just made this gesture of giving a seat to local people while they wait. It was a fire hazard. The seats were immediately removed. It was very dangerous. But what the project shows is that an anonymous product made for someone, not for me, but made for anyone by someone I don't know. There is this beautiful human gesture of materializing, I want to help you relieve your body weight. And I've made this thing and it now circulates as a commodity. I don't know who made it, but the object still offers that human gesture. I think if we co-design everything, if we are participating in the design of every toaster and every desk and every window and every piano, if we are involved in designing everything, A, it's exhausting. B, we lose this quality of gift that the anonymous design still gives. If we only have commodified products, we're materials intense and unsustainable. So we need to co-design for autonomy, yet still have interdependencies that allow products to arrive as gifts from I don't know who. And it seems to me that this is a good definition of cosmopolitan localism. It is mostly localized. It's not austere and scarce because it's control of design, not necessarily control of manufacture. It can still happen at scale. And it allows these anonymous products occasionally to still surprise us with the fact that someone somewhere offered this act of care that we have taken up. So it's a complicated argument about the power of design, the fact that design works at scale, that this scale is its problem, that in fact we are unsustainable because of that materials intensity. So we need to localize, we need co-design, we need to seize control of the means of design. but not entirely. We still need moments of interaction with anonymous things so that our societies remain cosmopolitan. So that was my attempt to explain that we are in a transition, design is changing, and that at this moment at which the world is trying to think about emerging from a pandemic, and hopefully maintaining the idea that we can be more equitable and sustainable on the other side, something that I felt we had at the beginning of the pandemic, but it feels that we've lost at the end of the pandemic as people just snap back to business as usual. In this moment of transition, the change in design towards co-designing allows us to design a transition to a world of more interdependent autonomy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cameron, for such a thought-provoking, as Delfina is saying in the chats, thought-provoking lecture. I'm going to speak in Spanish for a bit. So, gracias, Cameron, por una charla tan interesante. Aquí pido disculpas al público porque no sé muy bien cómo voy a hacer para hablar en castellano y en inglés, tratando de que nos entendamos todos. Pero me gustaría primero hacer un comentario importante, creo, de tu charla, si entendí bien. Hay una pregunta, la pregunta política, digamos, del diseño que tú propones, si entiendo bien, es esta idea, digamos, que parte, que la encuentro muy clara, ¿no? Que si bien la ley regula el caos y describe aquello que es permitido, el diseño, en el fondo, se encarga de regular aquello que es regulado, ese mundo material en el cual nos está permitido vivir. Y la pregunta sobre de dónde viene el poder de quienes diseñamos ese espacio de lo regulado es una pregunta que ha acompañado la evolución de la práctica del diseño, desde el artista teniendo todo el poder concentrado y quizás el poder delegado de algún lugar, hacia un espacio de codiseño donde este poder se distribuye, o por lo menos hay una idea de que este poder se distribuye. Y tu charla fue un poco contando cuáles son esas tensiones de ese poder distribuido y un poco del poder autónomo, ¿no? Y ese es el entendimiento que yo tengo, por lo menos, de esta idea, ¿no? Que le llamas de la autonomía interdependiente, digamos. Lo que propones al final es que es todo un poco entre medio, ¿no? Como mantener esta autonomía, esta mantenida de lo local, pero establecer vínculos interdependientes, si entendí bien. Creo que esa como pregunta, ¿no? de esa tensión, creo que está en el corazón de muchas discusiones que estamos viendo hoy día. Yo creo que hay hartas preguntas que aparecen ahí sobre eso. Me gustaría partir, antes de ir al público, que hay algunas preguntas, me gustaría partir preguntándote cómo ves tú ese espacio, digamos, de esa tensión del poder, siendo tú una persona que es en Norteamérica, luego Australia, digamos. ¿Cuál es tu visión, digamos, de esta autonomía interdependiente, pensando en el Global South, digamos, en el sur global y los desafíos que tenemos nosotros? Es una pregunta doble, ¿no? Primero desde el Global South, y luego en Chile estamos como extendiendo ese globo de lo regulado, ¿no? Estamos llegando a un diseño constitucional donde estamos expandiendo, ¿no? Y también tenemos herramientas para hacer eso. Entonces me gustaría tu reflexión en esas dos dimensiones, ¿no? Como desde el sur global y luego desde las herramientas que tenemos para expandir este círculo.
Great, thanks. So if I understand your question, I'll make three comments. The first, yes, goes back to that point about regulations regulate the irregular, and design takes care of what happens in the everyday, the other meaning in English of regular, that which I do regularly, my rituals, my daily habits. And again, it was a point made by Bruno Latour in reference to Brexit. So Britain wanted to recover sovereignty from the European Union. So Britain decides through a minority vote to separate from the European Union. So it recovers its power at the global level. But as Bruno Latour indicated, the weird thing is you can do that, and yet still your everyday lives, your kettle is made in China that you make your British tea with, right? It's actually manufactured in China. Your windows are actually coming to you and are a German design, and they've been made by Germans. Like in a weird way, you think you've won sovereignty because you can now make your own laws, but your everyday life is still actually written and controlled by other countries. And that's a very stark example, but I think it's a good way of just getting your head around this idea that designers have enormous power in the way in which they script everyday lives. So that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is that in terms of how designers negotiate this change that I was describing, it is a paradox, it's a contradiction. Designers need to be much more assertive about their power. They have this power, but they are very reticent to deploy it. They're always claiming we're just a service industry. We have no power. We must just do what the business contracting us tells us to do. We must just do what the customer allows. So designers control how society gets materialized, but then they say, no, we're just a service industry. I think that's because designers have not been educated in the way architects are educated to think of themselves as all powerful. Non-architectural designers have not been educated to seize this power. So oftentimes I'm just trying to convince designers to be more assertive, to talk back to clients, to talk back to governments, to talk back to customers. But the paradox is that you are being stronger, more forceful as a designer in order to hold space for co-design. So it's this weird act in which you have to be a strong revolutionary force to change design relations, to talk back to your client in order to create space to listen, to work with, to co-design. So it's this very contradictory moment. Designers, I think at the moment, are too servile. They need to be more assertive, but they need to be more assertive to open. So then the third thing I would say is that at this very point, which I did not talk about, at this moment at which design is moving from Bauhaus studio to co-design, is the same moment at which the Eurocentrism of design is being clearly declared. And so voices from non-European backgrounds, non-North American, non-North Atlantic backgrounds from, let's say, the Global South, are more assertively pointing out the role of design in the colonial history of the 20th century. And therefore, it seems to me that the people who should be articulating what co-design for interdependent autonomy is, the people who should be articulating the post-Bauhaus design must be the Global South, cannot in fact be me, must in fact be others. My job is to clear space to allow other voices to begin to write the future of design. The future of design is the way in which people in the continent of South America, in the continents of the Middle East and South Asia and East Asia, they will write what this new co-design for interdependent autonomy is. Because these are the converging transitions, capitalism running out of good ideas, design justice, decolonization. So that was a complicated last answer.
Yeah. And to follow up on that last answer, all of your views, I would say that they trust a lot in the designer capacity to change, the designer. And what do you think about, and that could mean that you have a strong, I would say, ethical or even moral standard for designers. But what are your thoughts in to be done in more general sense? So how you can make that happen in a more structural way, not just depending on the willingness to change of the designer. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it is happening right now in the way publics feel motivated to cancel, to use a North American term, not just people, but products. So the moment at which products do releases, particularly digital products, thinking about the hideous empire that is Facebook, for example, that when it does things, I am surprised that the same social media-based collectives that act politically against politicians also act politically against companies. And so designers are finding themselves at the front line of people questioning how they are materializing society. So I think practicing designers right now are having a huge professional crisis. So when a UX designer, a product designer at Facebook comes up with something that they think is going to make more money, and suddenly it has an unanticipated social impact, and a particular community disadvantaged by it start leaking papers or talking to the press, all of a sudden the politics of the designer that the designer has avoided recognizing, they are forced to confront it. So I think on the one hand, designers have a capacity to ally themselves, to make alliances with these new types of diverse communities who want localized versions of platforms, who want, by design, some access of control. Right now, national countries are trying to work out if they can't get rid of Facebook, if they can't hope that American antitrust laws break Facebook up, they want within their local jurisdictions to be able to insist on certain changes to the design of the platform for their local populations. So all of a sudden, these companies cannot offer the single global platform that just happens to be translated. They actually need to change the interaction, the actual back office of the platform for each different jurisdiction. And I think designers can use those local constituencies to help them make the argument for many designs, not one global design, to begin to combat this growth hacking scale at all costs, which is still underlying a lot of the digital economy. So my last point is that despite 100 years of design education and design beginning, as I said, almost as a kind of a socialist social improvement project, designers are woefully undereducated. Designers, non-architectural designers in particular, do not get enough education. They do not study long enough. They do not study diversely. They are not equipped yet to be the politicians that they are. And so much of my time is spent yelling, like I'm doing now, at design educators rather than designers. I think design educators for the last 30 years are very culpable for everything that exists in our society at the moment. We blame the companies. I think we should blame the teachers.
Great. Now I'm going to ask a question in Spanish. En el público, Ana, voy a ir, tenemos en el chat varias preguntas, voy a ir tratando de tomar algunas para poder seguir el hilo de la conversación, así que no están en orden de quien las hizo antes. Ana pregunta sobre una idea de una investigadora chilena, Liliana de Simone, que planteaba que en Chile hemos vuelto a la alegría post-pandémica, post-pandemic joy, something like that, no volviendo a disfrutar de la naturaleza, no sentirnos afuera, sino que volviendo a disfrutar del consumo. Y en el fondo, la pregunta, digamos, ella dice por varias razones, pero la pregunta dice, Ana, ¿qué piensas tú de ese deseo de consumo y de esa ambición dice ella, de tener diseño internacional o tener diseño global, de tener bienes de consumo globales? Y voy a combinar esa pregunta con otra que está de la gente que se escribió, que se pregunta, digamos, cómo diseñar, me imagino que es una diseñadora o un diseñador, cómo diseñar para el usuario chileno y crear marcas o productos con arraigo local. O sea, hay una tensión entre este diseño global, esta idea de consumo. And in the chat is in English, the question as well. Bueno, con esta idea local.
So first of all, can I just confirm the way Anna has framed the question at the beginning, which is, you know, initially under some lockdowns, people discovered small pleasures that were separate from the pleasure of work because they suddenly were working from home and discovered that there were many other things that were more pleasurable than the satisfiers of producing stuff at work. And some of those were nature-based. Some of those were, I just heard on the radio in Australia that a bird watching society was inundated by phone calls at the beginning of the pandemic of people saying, there's some bird going crazy. What's it doing? I'm very worried about it. And they had to say, no, that's just what birds do. You've just never noticed them before. You've never spent time looking at them. So definitely at the beginning, there was this really interesting discovery of other pleasures, some of which were nature-based, a lot of which were small, slow, local, baking bread, growing small crops, etc. Definitely by the end of the pandemic, I have been very depressed by how much the large political movements against lockdown are fighting for suburban normality. They want to go to the shops. They want to watch sport. They want to drink beer. And it was like, is that what we are revolting for these days? Is that you just want the status quo? Like, are your ambitions so low? So it's been very depressing to see the beginning of the pandemic, there's really interesting other pleasures. And then by the end, I just want my old pleasures back. And then, as Anna's indicated, definitely one can see that there are forces of global capital that are forcing those desires back on us. And in many ways, as I said at the beginning, I'm more concerned about the pleasures of work than I am about the pleasures of consumption. The pleasures of consumption are unsustainable, but I think a lot of what drives our unsustainable living is that we are too committed to working too much. I am a strong advocate for 4 3-day work weeks, working less, job sharing, generally downsizing. I think we need to stop being so addicted to having our subjectivity defined by our job. In terms of the question of localizing desires, again, the desperation of capital at the moment is to find local innovations. Before the pandemic, some of the talk was what was called global logistics, trying to work out how to localize for local markets. And what I'm talking about is not that, but that becomes something that a political designer can use to transition our societies. There is a desire to get more and more of the local market involved in the design process so that products can be tailored for that local market. But if you start giving voice to people so that they can at least get a local version of a global product, they will also start to think, why can't I just have a local product? So I think this is what it means to be a strategic political designer. You recognize that the drive to co-design might be driven by capitalism looking for value, but it can be used by you to give voice to new publics who can materialize their own desires for ways of living in products. So I think that it's not easy. You have to be a really clever political designer, and what will happen is that you will get fired, like you will lose your job, and you will annoy people. But it's kind of using neoliberal entrepreneurialism against neoliberalism. It's taking the risk of saying something political in a design research session so that you are helping the transition happen.
Great. Acá hay otra, I'm reading the chat, that's why I'm just trying to. There's another question here, it's in English actually. It's Fernando Palma from Bio University in Concepcion. It's another city in Chile. He says, I have been following this approach from different sides for a long time. I would like to ask, what other disciplines besides design that are important in making decisions are working with this approach? And how does design connect in that system? Perhaps we can connect this question also with other questions that is asking about the structural conditions that are needed in order for this transition design to flourish or evolve. I think are connected. So what are the disciplines? What is that system? And what are the structural conditions that we should be looking at to change?
So as I indicated, transition design saw its mission as correcting the undereducation of designers by finding knowledges and practices outside design that we think are relevant to designers, particularly designers wanting to make systems level change. So as I indicated, much of the knowledge comes from transition management, which is in the innovation policy and management realm. It tends to come out of a mix between policy and business disciplines. I think a lot of the work that I do here in Australia, I mentioned it also with Take Back the Economy, a book by Catherine Gibson Graham, famous for a collective author, famous for their work on feminist post-capitalism. And there's a large network now associated with them called the Community Economies Network. And these are people who are all developing and promoting alternative economic arguments other than neoclassical economics, which is obviously kind of dominating the structure. And their argument is always this very interesting one, that capitalism's trick, neoclassical economics' trick, is to convince us that a small part is the whole, that retail buying, selling, being on the market, competing, that life world is the whole world, that capitalism is everything. But in any country, developed, developing, whatever relation it has, if one does a time budget analysis of what people are doing, they spend most of their time not in retail competitive. That's what they do when they go shopping. That's what they do when they go to work. But they ask their neighbour to help with childcare. They contribute to a local tree planting exercise. They engage in helping out at the local school. There are all these alternative economies that are represented as the bottom of the iceberg. You can only see the capitalist tip. So the argument is we are already post-capitalist. There are already all these community economies, gift economies, cooperatives, lots of different structures, lots of socially embedded economies. Capitalism did not succeed in disembedding every economy from social relations. And that kind of goes, I think, to the answer of the structural conditions that need changing. I think it's very important that designers with the privilege to choose who they work for do choose to work for local cooperatives rather than global corporations. And secondly, that designers structure their own consultancies, their own operations as local cooperatives. I think it's very important that designers start walking the talk, as is the jargon. They start doing what they say. So they don't just design for cooperatives, but they model what it means to act as cooperative, many designers coming together in alliances for big projects, separating for small projects, coordinating. I'm doing this project, you're doing that project, two different clients. If we did a third speculative project, it would allow us to connect these and create an alternative future. We can do transition. So I think designers need to stop entering the economy just as competitive individuals and need to structure themselves as local cooperatives. Just recently, a service design company, very successful service design, one of the major service design companies in Australia called Meld Studios, recently switched to be an employee-owned cooperative. So they were founded by founders and people were just employed by them. They never became a publicly listed company. Many people have tried to acquire them. Instead, they moved to an employee-owned structure. So every employee is now an owner of the organization, and their wages are distributed in that cooperative fashion. So I think this is the structural change that designers need to do. They need to live community economies and design for community economies.
Great, very clear. We have a other question here. This was the first one. The first one is Delfina. She's asking, Delfina Fantini, thank you for your thought-provoking lecture. What are your views regarding the concept of co-design autonomy and control when applied to planet-centered design? That's the question. I imagine that. Go ahead.
Yes. So there is an interesting debate occurring, which Delfina might be alluding to, which is sort of Ben Bratton and the Strelka people advocating in response to certain philosophies under pandemic, and advocating in general as a project for a kind of planet-centeredness in governance structure and everything. And as a counter, I think, to perhaps the more Escobar pluriverse and the Latourian down-to-earth politics. Interestingly, the down-to-earth politics is not planet-centered. I am personally not convinced. I'm not convinced by this position, but I'm personally skeptical of planetariness. I'm not interested in that globe. I think that globe resists the capacity to think about pluriversality of many worlds on the one world. So I am more with Escobar and his appropriation of the Zapatista and the idea of pluralizing the number of coexisting worlds than I am convinced that thinking as a blue marble in space, to think about that kind of planetary metaphor. I'm not convinced that globalism, that planetary governance, and that planetary worldview, literally the worldview, that singular worldview, I'm concerned about that. I can't speak coherently about it. I haven't thought enough, but my gut makes me worried about terms like planet-centered. And I think what I'm advocating incoherently under interdependent autonomy is more like Escobar's pluriverse, which on the other hand risks pluralism more than it is that planetary one. So I'm sort of dodging the question by saying I don't think it's possible to co-design planetary. I think co-design forces a back-to-earth localism, multi-localism. Yeah, but I'm not convinced of it.
Yeah, changing the topic a little bit, I was receiving another question. Is that this interview that some of us in the team we were reading in volume, a recent interview when you criticize, well, among other things, but the lean startup and that kind of stuff, advocating for what you mentioned, something like vision-driven design. So where are the visions that design is used to create? What are your thoughts on that tension between? I would say two things. One is the vision that might come from as we spoke at the beginning, perhaps some value-based or like as an ethical imperative, but also the idea of creativity in general, not the technocratic approach in creativity, but just the craftsmanship or the artistic view of the designer that enable us to create or to envision sort of the great visions. What are your thoughts on that part of design connected with this, with the ones that we've been discussing today?
So the first half of the question, definitely I do try to argue that vision-led designing is opposed to what I would call the very presentist, very focused on the present version of value capture that is lean startup, which are rapid cycles of build, measure, design, build, measure, design. And they are rapid cycles that are trying to find current pain points and then find current value propositions and to closely couple with lead users till you get to something that's scalable. And that seems to me to be an abandonment of vision. And it's important to remember that a lot of lean startup was trying to counter a lot of venture capital, Silicon Valley venture capital, which still is quite vision driven, but this is the singular vision of the entrepreneur. I have a vision that the world will drink this pasty substance out of a bottle instead of eating food anymore, just to use the example of Soylent. I have a vision that the entire world will replace all meals with this manufactured food. And the founder has this strong vision and everybody else's job is just to deliver the founder's vision. And that's the type of venture that only has a 1 in 20 shot of making it. So venture capital kind of said, well, this isn't working. We need to empower the designers to pivot away from the founder's vision. And so what's happened is that visions have sort of been evacuated to just slogans around value propositions or general principles or quite abstract manifestos. They're collections of words. That's not a vision. A vision for me is something you can see. So on the one hand, the problem with visions is that they've just been reduced to abstractions. And then there's a second problem, which is that we don't have a good ecosystem, diverse ecosystem for visioning. We have architectural photo montages. We sometimes have sort of utopian illustrations. And then we have Black Mirror. We have dystopian filmmaking. We don't have rich world building skills. And I think there is a real craft that designers need to acquire to find ways of telling stories of alternative ways of living, not in the abstract, but at the concrete, regular, everyday level. What does it look and what will it look and feel like to live in this way? And being able to story tell that, multimodal, many different types of visions, ways of communicating, artifacts from the future, taking from design futuring, you bring these things, prefigure, let people feel. I think there's a real craft to that. Secondly, on the second half of your question, so I've talked a little bit about the fact that I think transition design is about crafting visions with people, not founders imagining sudden light bulb while in the shower and then imposing it on the world. No, these are constantly modified visions for how we want to live, and they're not principles. They have richness. They're rich pictures, and that's a craft. But secondly, I think the whole point of cosmopolitan localism is to create space for craft. At the moment, few designers, very few, just the people who are small run solo producers get to exhibit at the Milan Furniture Fair. There is less and less time to actually be a craftsperson's version of design, to really take time to resolve at the level of pixel what it is that might work in a particular context and surprise with new types of beauty and change the culture by alerting people to other types of form. We get less and less time to do that. And so part of cosmopolitan localism, to localize the economy, is to slow things down, to create more time for designers to design and for designers to design craft-wise. So often when craft-based designers dismiss transition design as all theory and strategy and politics, I get very frustrated because I'm like, I'm trying to help make space for you to do what you want to do. If you just keep wanting to craft without changing the system, you will get squashed out by lean UX, by lean startup. You will have 3 hours to come up with a design before it has to get built and shipped so that we can see where the users value it. So I think there's absolutely a place. It's what I meant with Dick Buchanan's higher orders of design. There is always time spent with materials, crafting forms. It's just within what vision, to what end, and not just for your pleasure, but for the pleasure of those who will use it, and how to involve them in that crafting.
Great. Bueno, muchas gracias, Cameron. Aquí no alcanzamos a contestar todas las preguntas del público, eran varias, nos llegaron también por otros medios. Yo creo que hay varias que se parecen, digamos. Yo creo que el mensaje es muy claro, hay una idea, hay un llamado, digamos, a los diseñadores y diseñadoras, básicamente a tomar control de nuestra práctica y a tener ideas o tener un entendimiento político e incluso un imperativo ético para enfrentarnos a estos momentos de transición. De verdad te lo agradecemos mucho por haber hecho esta charla inaugural. Y queremos ahora, en el último, no sé, 2 o 3 minutos, Trinidad Guzmán, que es la directora del área de diseño del Ministerio de las Culturas, las Artes y el Patrimonio. Si estás por ahí, Trinidad, si quieres hacer un cierre. Muchas gracias, Cameron.
Hola a todos y todas. Hi, Cameron. Voy a hablar en español. Verdaderamente ha sido un honor tenerte como invitado, el primer invitado de este Mes del Diseño 2021, en el cual estamos de aniversario, cumpliendo 10 años, en el que estamos desde el área de diseño del Ministerio de las Culturas, las Artes y el Patrimonio, impulsando las políticas y fomentando el rol del diseño y la difusión de esta disciplina que hoy se encuentra en tránsito. Quiero agradecerles a todos por estar presentes hoy, comentarles que esta es la primera de muchas actividades que tenemos en este Mes del Diseño. Pueden visitarlo en la página web mesdeldiseño.cl y que también quedará grabada esta masterclass en el YouTube de Economías Creativas del Ministerio, en donde pueden compartirlo con sus amigos, con sus conocidos y quienes tengan el interés de este tema del diseño en transición, del diseño colaborativo y cómo la investigación y la aplicación de ella puede cambiar la manera en la cual nos estamos relacionando hoy en día. Así que les agradezco, muchas gracias en nombre del Ministerio, del área de diseño, y estamos viéndonos, espero, en persona, Cameron, prontamente, poder tenerte acá y poder seguir aprendiendo de tu conocimiento. Así que muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you.